lot of Americans today foolishly believe that our government and our legal system were based on the story of the Ten Commandments, on a fictional covenant between God or Moses and Jehovah, I think would be a better way to describe that. Or they think that our government was based on biblical values, as if there ever was such a thing. It's not only false but absurd under scrutiny, and you don't have to know much history to know that that's wrong, but the more that you know, the more wrong that is. Contrary to what many Americans now believe, the United States was initially founded as the first explicitly secular government. And I know everybody in every other country that I've been to knows that, but I still have a difficult time trying to explain that to Americans. And a good example of this is Marco Rubio, current presidential candidate, who said that our country was founded on the slogan, "In God We Trust," even though that slogan didn't exist until 180 years after our country was founded. And I've actually had people tell me explicitly that they believe that our country was founded by God. Now, our actual human founders included some influential leaders who were neither Christian nor fond of Christians. In fact, some of our founders wrote scathing condemnation of Christianity. But even those of our founders who were Christian knew from firsthand what happens every time religion acquires rule over law. The result has always been an automatic violation of human rights, and this is what theocracy always does until such time as it loses its influence over a hopefully wiser populace who won't tolerate that sort of repression anymore. And the only time that religion is polite is when it has no power. And the more compliant people are, the more power religion has, which is why, for example, the very name of Islam commands submission. So while our pre-Darwinian Declaration of Independence and our national constitution may have vague deistic references to a creator, elsewhere described as nature's God, the name Jesus Christ appears nowhere in either document. And nature's God is a deist reference, but where a Christian may imagine that the later reference to divine providence must refer to Jesus, a Jew or a Muslim might assume that it refers to the Father God instead, and a Hindu, a Sikh, or even a pantheist might have a completely different interpretation of God altogether, including the God of Einstein and Spinoza, which isn't really a deity at all, but just a collection of the laws of nature. So our founding documents were deliberately ambiguous, written the way they were for that reason, in order to accommodate any religion or none. And Americans are very keen on the Second Amendment of the Constitution, where we have a right to bear arms, but we seem to ignore the First Amendment, which is where we have a freedom of religion, where Congress can make no law even respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And one thing that my countrymen fail to understand is that once a government establishes a religion, it invariably also imposes that religion, which of course compromises all others. So it is not possible to have freedom of religion without having freedom from religion, and this is why the First Amendment contradicts the First Commandment, which is another fact that many Americans seem to have overlooked and don't understand even when I've explained it. Our founding fathers were an elite league of wealthy aristocrats, well-educated at a time when most people never received a secondary education, if they got a first one. And the fact that so many of them had such disdain against religion caused a backlash, such that early in our history there were repeated waves of religious revivalism. And because religion likes to reverse everything, they refer to this religious revivalism as the Great Awakening. The advantage of faith over reason is that reason requires understanding, which requires education, which requires resources of time and intelligent comprehension and accurate source material vetted by scholarship. But religion needs none of that, because it's just talking out of your ass. Pretending to know things no one even can know, pretending that you'll never die. It allows the lowliest idiot to pretend that he is wiser than the wise, ignoring every indication otherwise, as if he has the direct connection to the ear of the most powerful being imaginable, Someone that could even make 2 plus 2 equal the square root of -1, if that's what it takes. A desperate emotional mind will accept irrational answers, especially if one doesn't know better and doesn't want to. And that, as I see it, is very often the problem. We believe different things for different reasons. I believe what I do is a logical consequence of my understanding of the facts, and my position will obligately change according to my understanding, which hopefully will improve. And I think that evidence is the only reason anyone should ever believe anything, and that a secure confidence should be reserved for those times when evidence is both indisputable and overwhelming. Whenever there could be a doubt, there should be. And I think that's what skepticism is. Critical thinking, so as not to be fooled. As I understand it, a fool is one who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence, or when one believes such claims completely without any doubt, as all of these supposedly sacred scriptures require. So it's not at all surprising that the Bible and the Quran both use the opposite definition of fool than the dictionary does. They will say that you're a fool if you don't gullibly swallow it all and believe it on faith just because they said so. And they're telling you this because they're trying to fool you, obviously. They're both questionable sources, making outrageously dubious claims without any evidence at all. And all of their power, whether it is controlling principalities, collecting tithe, and regulating and restricting everybody's personal lives, all comes from duping the masses. Deception is the source of all of their power. But if you believe whatever you're told, without question, without reservation, and certainly without reason, then by definition, you're a fool. And I believe that the human authors of these and other books pretending to speak for God knew that, and that's why they tried to reverse the definition. So what I see is a division where at the extremes, you have one group that has a deep-seated emotional need to believe, and on the other extreme, you have people that desire to understand. Those who have that desire will inquire, and those who don't won't. Which is why when somebody falls away from their religion, they're ostracized, criticized, bastardized, but nobody ever questions why. And in the relatively rare case that somebody comes from a non-religious background and adopts a religious belief, the reason they believe that is the only thing we want to know because we want to understand. And that's why it is that when you're trying to explain science to irrational believers, they're deliberately obtuse. They're intentionally trying to maintain a misunderstanding. They don't want to understand what they don't want to know, or they don't want to know what they don't want to know. They want to believe something else, and they'll find any excuse necessary to rationalize that. And if you try to press on to teach somebody who doesn't want to believe, to get them to understand a particular premise or concept, get them to acknowledge that progress and then move on to the next step, they'll stop you very early on, sometimes with the admission that they don't want to know, they just want to believe. And I don't have a choice to believe whatever I want. All I can believe is whatever is indicated. But religious extremists have admitted that they believe what they do as an act of will, of mind over matter, the power of positive thought, as if wishes might come true if you can believe hard enough. And of course, I'm not talking about everybody, but there have been people who've told me that they want to believe with all their heart. And this tells me that those people are lying to themselves. And I've even seen ministers, I know ministers, who have said defense of this under the colloquialism, fake it till you make it. Just keep lying to yourself until you believe it. As a matter of fact, as an anecdotal example, one of my best friends from high school, who is now a fundamentalist Baptist preacher, once upon a time when we were teenagers, we had a conversion experience, where I accepted Jesus, like everybody else does. And I inquired of my friend, I said, how do I know that this euphoria that I feel like I'm wandering around as a daze, the way people hypnotize themselves. I said, how do I know that this euphoria is real? And that I didn't just imagine it, or that it didn't come from some other source. And he grabbed me by both shoulders with a huge beaming smile and said, just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it. which tells me that faith is a willfully ignorant, autodeceptive self-delusion, and that was my last instant as a Christian. And sometimes when I pointed out some inconvenient truth that disproves their point, their response is that I'm hurting people. People that still want to believe what I've just disproved. They continue to want to believe it even after they know it's wrong. But why would you want to believe something after you know that it's not even probably true? And they'll tell me that they're going to believe, these may be what the facts are, but I want to believe this. And that is an admission that they don't care what the truth really is. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone, of course. Some people are born into it, indoctrinated early, and never questioned it because everyone around them believes the same thing. So it must be true, right? Or I've had people tell me that they believe what they do because they want to, because they have to, because they're afraid not to. And one of my friends from about 20 years ago told me that I'm Christian because I like to believe that, not because I think it's true. And I don't think he realizes what he's admitted to me. And even in the case where they admit that on some level they know that it's not really true, I often hear that even if it's not true, we should believe it anyway. As if believing it anyway will somehow make us better people. And we know statistically that it doesn't. If you look at all the demographics for the most religious areas and the least religious areas, and you compare their crime rate, and especially their murder rate, and their child poverty rate, their education levels, teen pregnancy, all of these things, you see that belief in God statistically makes you a worse person. But these people believe what they want to believe simply because they want to believe it. But it's hard to just make up whatever you want to believe and convince yourself of that. On your own alone, you will doubt yourself. And if you're the only one who believes in some particular lunacy that no one else shares with you, then you're considered crazy. So you have to make believe the same nonsense as everyone else. And the more people who will endorse and support a particular delusion, the easier it is to pretend that it's all really real. And you can't have anyone ruining the fantasy. So you have to elect judges and leaders who endorse that same belief as well. And this has been the case all through history, with a couple of exceptions in the history of secularism, like when my country was founded. But we fell back into religion immediately after that and became really religious immediately. Our first unambiguously Trinitarian president, Christian president, was Andrew Jackson, our sixth president in 1828. Yet every president after him has been an avowed believer, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln. It has been said that you can't get the vote if you don't profess a religious belief. In fact, Bernie Sanders recently had to claim a religious faith that I don't think he actually has, at least not the way I understand those words. Our federal Constitution, written in 1787, says that there will be no religious test to any office or public trust in these United States. And the Texas state constitution, written about 90 years later, also says that no candidate will face any religious test, provided they affirm a supreme being. To put it another way, the Texas state constitution doesn't care what religion you are as long as you are religious. And if you're not religious, then you may be barred from public office. And we've been trying in Texas to get any non-believer elected so that we could challenge that in the courts. But you can't get the votes in Texas unless you claim to be a Bible-believing Christian first. So fast forward a few years to 1925 and the Scopes monkey trial. At that time, it was illegal to teach evolution in public schools. After a few successful contests in court, we got to 1987, where it is legal now to teach evolution, but it has suddenly become illegal to teach creationism. And this was the catalyst that I think prompted what the American Christian fundamentalists refer to as the culture war. Our science advances, but in an environment inundated with superstitious beliefs, and this is where I come in. I became an activist advocating science education about 20 years ago, when I saw how the creationist organizations were undermining science in public schools. Now, the polls that I've seen show that 48 to 51% variable of Americans believe that the universe is less than 10,000 years old, and that humans appeared in their current form sometime within that time without any evolution. Of course, we're just created by magic by God. That's half of us. Adding to that, and I realize these demographics do change a little bit, but not in comfortable ways, add to this that 20% of our high school teachers, and this includes our high school science teachers, are young earth creationists. They are incompetent to the task, and they are prone to deception in order to control what kids believe. I can give many anecdotal examples, but my favorite is my son's science teacher, who told the class that there was never any such thing as a beneficial mutation. My son raised his hand and said, "But teacher, the textbook lists beneficial mutations." And he was sent to the office for insubordination. I wanted to make that teacher famous. But my son's mother asked me not to raise a stink while he was in school, and by the time he was out, that teacher was out as well. Secular teachers don't often understand evolution well enough to teach it, and if they don't, I would rather they not. This is why my wife and I write a series of classroom supplement videos teaching nationals. My wife is a curriculum specialist with the Next Generation Science Standards, which translates into national standards, but we don't tell people in Texas that it's national standards. We go by the name because they don't know. But this enables us to write everything that the students are supposed to be tested on, and so that and these will include evolution, ancient, deep time, and other concepts like that, endosymbiosis and things like that creationist schools will try to avoid. So a teacher can put on our videos, play them to the class, and this is also done in homeschools. Because in Texas, a lot of people homeschool their kids because they're afraid that their children will learn forbidden knowledge. But a lot of other people homeschool their kids because they know what's happened to the education situation, and that their kids aren't going to learn science unless they teach them themselves. Now, teachers who understand evolution and are capable of teaching it may still want to not personally endorse it, which is another reason it would be good to just put in our video and then they don't have to claim responsibility for it. Because students have been trained by their church groups to disrupt the class on certain keywords. When they hear evolution, Big Bang, millions of years, they will cite pseudoscience and logical fallacies. And if you get past that, then you've got angry letters from parents. And if you get past that, then the teacher risks reactions from associates and even administrators. It all depends on the administrator. While this is difficult to prove in every case, we do know that at least some high school science teachers in Texas have been fired for teaching evolution, even though that's part of the job description. So creationism is a form of religious extremism, requiring a degree of reality denial. Every creationist organization that I'm aware of, and I've seen all the big names, posts a statement of faith. And you can Google this. You put in Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research, whatever the group is, whatever the Christian school is, and then add the term statement of faith. And it will direct you to public declarations, which will paraphrase. They'll say it in different ways, but they've announced, as if this were something to be proud of, that they will automatically and thoughtlessly reject any and all evidence that might ever arise should it conflict with their interpretation of Bronze Age folklore. They have already admitted that they have already rejected all the evidence there could ever be, such that no matter how true the truth really is, no amount of proof will ever change their minds. The creationists reject evolution specifically, but more importantly, they also reject methodological naturalism, which is an integral aspect of the application of science. And creationists want to replace that in some applications with a belief in magic. Now, creationists typically don't admit that they believe in magic. They say they believe in miracles. But miracles and magic share essentially the same definition. That is the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways which are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics. And if you need a further illustration of that, Adam was created in what was considered in the Hebrew tradition to be a golem spell, where you create a clay figurine and you breathe into it the breath of life. And you usually have to soak these in sacrificial blood, too, by the way. And of course, anything that speaks anything else into existence, that's an incantation spell. And somehow, creationists think that anything that science can't explain is explained by magic. You can't explain that, therefore, God. As if God is made of the things we don't know. As if unexplained means explained by magic. And even the things that science does explain, if the answer is complicated, then religion still wins. Because belief in magic wishes is a whole lot easier for some people to grasp than complicated concepts that require prior understanding or in-depth knowledge. And evoking supernatural explanations doesn't actually explain anything, but it eases the mind who can't or won't understand otherwise. And remember that a lot of these people don't want to know what the truth really is. They think that criticizing natural explanations somehow proves the supernatural, that if you think that evolution is impossible, that somehow makes a magical creation possible. They don't understand the logical fallacy, the false dichotomy. They don't understand the concept of the null set, or the idea that gods and magic are not the default position, that if you can disprove science, well, then that reveals gods and magic. No. When you don't have an explanation, it means you don't have an explanation. You're still looking for one. And the option that they have suggested is an unsupported assertion and therefore unworthy of serious consideration. Understand that positive claims require positive evidence even when you're talking about a God. Now, you're free to believe in a God. You're welcome to believe in any horse shit you like. But if you don't have any evidence to show that your claims are correct, that one of the ways I like to put it is if you can't confirm the accuracy of any of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then logically, you cannot actually know what you claim to know, that you really only believe that. And it is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, yet that's what all religions do. Religion has always been a means of manipulation of the masses, and they do this by the indoctrination of faith, often targeting young children before they reach the age of reason. Because if you wait until they're 8 or more years old, and then you tell them about Noah's Ark, and sticks turning into snakes, and the sun stopping in the sky, and especially Adam and Eve, and all of this requires that they unknow everything they already know to be true, you're going to have a hard time brainwashing that child. But if you get them before that age, you can convince them of all kinds of irreconcilable nonsense. And because religion stunts intellectual development, they may never develop the ability to question that. And it's not enough that they deceive their own children, because if yours are the only kids on the block who believe in talking snakes and donkeys, and the tower to heaven, and guys living inside fish, then through peer pressure alone, they're not going to believe that very long. So all their peers have to believe the same thing too. And consequently, Christian schools have sprung up all over my country so that all these kids are taught the Bible as if it were real, and no one is taught evolution. But that's not good enough, because religion is a delusion that needs to infect everybody. In 1999, the Discovery Institute, an organization dedicated to making creationism seem scientific, accidentally released an internal memo not intended for worldwide distribution. And it held a long-term agenda to defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies, and to replace materialistic explanations with the theistic understanding that nature and human beings were created by God. They meant to replace evolution with creationism, not just in the Christian schools, but in every school across the country. This was called a wedge because they intended to use pseudoscience arguments to generate doubt, not just in evolution, but in science in general, and thus creating an opening for religious beliefs. And their ultimate goal was to reshape our entire culture by promoting evangelical Protestant Christian fundamentalism at all levels of society, including government. The wedge document from the Discovery Institute mirrored the agenda of, or the goals of other fundamentalist organizations like the Chalcedon Institute, which ran from the 1960s through the 1990s. The Chalcedon Institute's goal was to eventually, slowly, legally, and peacefully take over all American government and turn it into a theocracy that would enforce biblical law. And their founder, R.J. Rushdoony, specified that what he meant by that was the barbaric book of Leviticus, where women could be killed just for being raped, and where homosexuals would be killed as an abomination. This was the Christian version of Sharia law, where it would be imposed even on unbelievers. It was called Reconstructionism, or also called theonomy, God's law. And a number of Chalcedon Institute's affiliates and subordinates were connected with other devoutly religious hate groups. In fact, they themselves are listed in the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. But there's also the Rutherford Institute, which was founded by Chalcedon. Now, the Rutherford Institute's goal was to get evangelical Christians elected at all levels of government, with the ultimate intent that they completely take over political conventions, which they have effectively done. Many of our senators and judges and so forth have been connected to Chalcedon or Rutherford or other similar hardcore evangelical organizations and institutions. Information on all these conspiracies are detailed in their own words on various websites. And as I said, they all but succeeded. They still can't enforce biblical law. Another form of dominionism is represented by the presidential candidate Ted Cruz, who reportedly holds to the New Apostolic Reformation, in which Christians are to reclaim the 7 mountains of culture: government, religion, media, family, business, education, and arts and entertainment. A lot of this is funded by very wealthy conservatives, like the Koch brothers. And these are a set of billionaires who have donated tens of millions of dollars to evangelical organizations, even though they haven't seemed to have expressed any evangelical beliefs themselves. It seems that these are the people that understand that religion is useful and a means of manipulation, though they also support practically everything that goes on in the Republican Party. And there was recently an admission from within that the Republican Party is owned and controlled by the Koch brothers. And back home in Texas, we have our own financier of fundamentalism. James Leininger has $200 million, and he has invested large sums of his money into various religious and political groups in order to change policy. He is the reason that we have a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, because American politics is all about money. You can basically buy elections. James Leininger is also a big fan of school vouchers, and this is where money from the government that's supposed to go to public schools ends up being rerouted to charter schools and private schools. This leaves the privileged kids going to the charter schools and the private schools, and the underprivileged kids are now in underfunded schools, which statistically cause them to underperform. James Leininger, like a lot of right-wing Republicans, don't like the fact that Texas Constitution has a provision where we must provide a free education for all of our citizens, but the only way that they can amend that in the Constitution is to show that the Texas education system has failed, and the only way to show that is to have made it fail. So they route money to other schools, like charter schools, which can't be regulated properly and are prone to corruption, and almost all of the private schools are exclusively Christian schools teaching that the Bible is the only source of truth in our world, which means more kiddies being taught biblical lessons as if it were actual history, and fewer kids understanding reality. James Leininger has also paid tens of thousands of dollars each to seat right-wing Republican Christian conservative creationists on our State Board of Education. Texas has a board of panelists who approve all of our textbooks, but they don't just approve what's already out there, they also change them. They request revisions, paraphrasing, rephrasing, however necessary, in order to censor certain ideas and promote other ideas according to their agenda. Publishers cannot refuse these requests because Texas is one of the largest textbook buyers, and if California isn't buying that year, then what happens is the publishers will produce a Texas-specific textbook which will then be distributed to everyone else, such that this dozen or so volunteers somehow controls the education for everyone in the country. And I should specify that some of these people on the Board of Education have been famously, grossly undereducated. There are some that have advanced degrees, but there are others who have only been homeschooled, homeschool their own kids, and speak out against public education. One of them wrote a book saying that public education was a tool of the devil because it didn't promote Jesus. Another famously said that all this critical thinking stuff is gobbledygook, and children should be allowed to jump to their own conclusions. So Leininger gave tens of thousands of dollars to each of these largely undereducated people who had no competence for the job. And our governor, which Leininger also helped place, our former governor, Rick Perry, has repeatedly chosen the most batshit crazy fundamentalists on the board to serve as chairman of the board. And the result of that has been an international embarrassment, so that people in other countries, in Australia, for example, know who my chairman of the board is, or at least at that time, because this was the guy who would readily dismiss the combined testimony of 150 scientists because he's a dentist who thinks he can stand up to experts. I had a debate with this guy where he was supposed to moderate a debate. There was two people on the Board of Education that were supposed to moderate in this debate that my wife set up, where I was debating against two evangelical ministers. One of them admitted that he knew that there were transitional species in the fossil record, but he wanted to teach students there were none, because he said it was important that they believe there are none. So here is an admission that it is okay to lie to other people's kids in order to control what they believe. So just before the wedge document was accidentally leaked, I had already heard from a number of evangelicals bragging that they had positioned certain judges and senators and so forth for the next stage of their perceived culture war. And that next stage was detailed in the wedge document once it finally came out. The Discovery Institute is not a science organization, as they build themselves to be. They're really more of a league of lawyers. And so what they had done was to put conservative Christian judges all over the country, coordinated effort through all these different church groups, voting as a block, just like their ministers tell them to do, despite their tax-free status not having any threat of that. And the purpose was so that they could countersue whenever anybody tried to sue their school districts for being, teaching pseudoscience. And this finally happened in Dover, Pennsylvania. Creationists in the public schools there didn't want to hear the name of Darwin. They didn't want to hear about evolution. They encouraged their Board of Education, their school boards, to adopt an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. The purpose of the phrase intelligent design is an illusion meant to create the impression that there is a scientific objection to evolution. Their previous attempt to do this was called creation science. But the veneer was too thin, and a judge saw that it was just pseudoscience propaganda meant to promote religion, and this was why in 1987 it became illegal to teach creationism in public schools. But religion is relentless, and they think they're in a culture war. So they invented intelligent design so that they could spew the same nonsense and continue on in secular schools. I was in studio in TV for a local, in Dallas for a local TV show where they were doing a comparison of worldviews. So they had three men on stage. First, they had a evolutionist. This is the way they build it, as if accepting scientific facts is equivalent to a religion. Then on the other side of the stage, they had a creationist, and in the middle, they had an intelligent design proponent. They did not admit that he was a creationist also, because they wanted to create that illusion that this was something in the middle, something with scientific justification. And remember, these people knew better and are deliberately lying. And the way we know that is investigators in the Dover trial discovered that The textbook of Pandas and People had been printed in multiple editions, including prior to the ruling in 1987, where it was illegal to teach creationism in public schools. So they compared the first edition to the most recent edition, and what they discovered was that there was only one significant change. Wherever the word creationism originally appeared, it had been replaced. In 1987, a macro command replaced it with the words intelligent design, including the definition, so that intelligent design and creationism are the same thing. They have the same definition, but creationists are still lying about that. And the other change that's connected to that was that whenever it originally said creationists, it now says design proponents, except one place where there was a misspelling that confused the macro command, and it said see design proponentsists. So they knew full well what they were doing. They were lying to get around the law to do something illegal. These are the people who promote morality. So it is not possible to defend creationism honestly, but it didn't matter that it wasn't enough that they caught their witnesses lying again and again and again. Because it had gone to court, it was now incumbent on the court to show that there was no truth to their claims. And this is where they thought that having a George Bush appointed conservative Christian Republican judge would assure their success, because creationists never admit when they're wrong. However, simply being Christian doesn't mean that you're a religious extremist. It doesn't mean that you're a reality denialist. And the judge in this case was a moderate Christian and a proper judge. And he lamented the fact that so many of these witnesses would so proudly tout their religious convictions in public, as he put it, and then time and again lie to cover their tracks and conceal the real purpose behind the ID policy. For example, Dr. Michael Behe took the stand as the only biologist willing to defend intelligent design. And he confidently said that science will never find an evolutionary explanation for the immune system. But the judge noted that he was presented with 58 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and several immunology textbook chapters about the evolution of the immune system. However, he simply insisted that this was still not sufficient evidence of evolution and that it wasn't good enough. The court also ruled that all of the testable claims of intelligent design had already been refuted and rejected by science. So the science deniers didn't get the ruling that they wanted. And nor would they admit that they had lost the court case. Instead, legions of them found an alternate plan. In each of the states, many of them, they found loopholes in the different education systems laws, allowing, for different reasons in different places, that there would be thousands of schools across the United States that will not teach evolution, and there are thousands more that teach creationism, or more specifically, to teach the Bible as if it were a matter of historic and scientific fact. Now, these lessons have also been shown to include anti-Semitism, and of course a rejection of science, as well as a denigration of other religions, and the instilling of right-wing political ideologies, which is what this is really all about. Bear with me a moment. Now, they also had a program called the Good News Clubs, which was billed as after-school activities and seems perfectly harmless, but what they really do is full-tilt evangelizing to young students, often regardless of parental consent. They not only fill their heads full of Jesus, they also train the kids how to react when their parents object to these kinds of lessons. So they're dividing the children from their parents. And I don't know how this goes on without lawsuits all over the place, but it's been happening for years. But the culture war isn't just about instilling religious dogmatism, it's also about impressing the oppression, repression, and political practices consistent with religious fundamentalism. And in Texas, that meant no more sex education. Instead, they teach abstinence only. My wife was teaching middle school when they had a state-funded Christian conservative, an old guy with a belt up to here, who came into the class to lie to the students, saying, among other things, that oral sex didn't feel good. And somebody brought up, the last time I mentioned this, they brought up that it might be because so many of the kids had braces. The reason he gave was that you're so worried about catching a sexually transmitted disease that you can't enjoy the blowjob. Abstinence only is the idea that any pill can serve as a birth control pill if the girl holds it between her knees. Literally, they do nothing more than simply tell teenagers not to have sex, as if that would work. That all you have to do is deny one of the strongest biological urges that any organism has, and you have to do that at the peak of its chemical and social influence over you, and that you have to do this with no understanding of it because we're not going to give you any useful information because we're afraid you'll use it. The Abstinence Only program brags that it is the only 100% effective way to prevent pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. However, just before my wife and I left Texas to go on this tour, we noted that one of the local high schools was reporting a chlamydia outbreak. Texas has one of the highest rates of teen pregnancy. I think it's the second highest rate of teen pregnancy. And we also have the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancy. And just to share how bad our education system is, one of the news stories, and I'm not kidding about this, said that the trend in teen pregnancies falls back down once the children reach 25. We also have one of the highest rates of child poverty because it's a negative feedback loop. They've canceled, the right-wing Republicans have famously canceled all of our abortion clinics and have done everything they could to cut the education budget in half and to also end social benefit programs that would have aided unwed mothers, teen mothers, and so forth. The program has been such a colossal failure that I'm happy to announce that President Obama has just a month or so ago canceled federal funding for it because it was the federal government paying for that for about a decade. So it's not enough that our kids are poor and pregnant. No, they don't know how things work. It's not enough that they're religious because the system that did that ultimately wants to control how they vote so that they will elect extreme militant right-wing ideologues wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. And how do you inspire such jingoism? Through fear and lies. In George Orwell's most famous book, 1984, says that those who control the past control the future. So, of course, our Board of Indoctrination also had to alter our history in subtle ways that they hoped no one would notice. And the goal here was to promote American exceptionalism. The idea that our political system and our values were unique in all the world and that our history follows along manifest destiny, which was something they actually taught me in school. And this meant, well, I remember going back to people saying that the United States was founded by God and guided by God, right? Directed by God. And this meant that certain embarrassing errors in our history had to be glossed over, minimized, or omitted. So, for example, Christianity is credited with everything good that ever happened, but our embarrassing history with slavery and civil rights are minimized as if it wasn't really all that bad, or maybe it didn't happen at all. Rather than admit that the Civil War was fought over slavery, our history books now say that it was fought over states' rights. And slavery was seldom mentioned at all. As a matter of fact, one of the textbooks got sued because it referred to the slaves as workers. So in Texas, these classes are also often called social studies rather than history because it is a blend of cultural ancestries. But our Texas history, our social studies textbooks have omitted most ethnic references to indigenous people and other ethnicities, and everything has been reworded so that it seems that only white people ever did anything important. For example, in one of our textbooks, when once mentioned hip-hop music, it was changed to country western. There was an attempt to remove a few Latino heroes, and also, it was a failed attempt to remove Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, because they didn't want to have a black role model in a respected position of authority. Our history books have arguments supporting segregation, and while they don't say anything negative about the Ku Klux Klan in Texas, Louisiana's textbooks, one of them, describes the KKK as respected community leaders promoting morality. Louisiana uses overtly Christian books, including the Bible itself, because it's one of those states where it is legal now to teach full-on creationism. And our friend Zach Copeland was a high school student when that became legal, and he became an activist trying to sue his state over this. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be presenting here actually comes from his website, where he's named different textbooks and what they say. His textbooks in Louisiana, not his, but Louisiana's books, promote paranoid and prejudiced propaganda, instilling and spreading right-wing religious ideology, including the denigration of gays, liberals, and otherwise celebrated thinkers like Emily Dickinson and Mark Twain. One of Louisiana's textbooks describes Mark Twain as a confused hack. One of Louisiana's textbooks says that the goal of environmentalism isn't to preserve natural resources for future generations, but rather the goal of environmentalism is to destroy the economies of the world's richest nations. Why does the textbook say that? Because we're addicted to fossil fuels and we must promote the oil industry. So this is the propaganda that we're taught in our schools accordingly. There's one textbook in Louisiana that says that homosexuality should be treated as a capital crime. And one of the Louisiana science textbooks says that the existence of the Loch Ness Monster disproves evolution. Nationwide, our children are taught that the founding fathers were Christian when many were not, and we were told that our nation was based on biblical values of the Ten Commandments, when there's no truth to that at all. But our history books now say that Moses was a historic person, that he was born in the 13th century BCE, even though biblical scholars can't agree on when he should have been born, and many say that he was never born at all. And archaeologists agree almost unanimously, saying that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all, and now we know several reasons that it couldn't have happened at all. The consensus among critical scholars is that there's no truth to the Exodus whatsoever. But our history books back the Bible. And Moses is listed first among the authors who inspired the framers of the Constitution. And there's a footnote advising the kids to read the Bible for more information about Moses. But the fact is that our founders were famously, adamantly against every system of government that is associated with Moses. And if Moses existed, he certainly would have objected to anything democratic. Our books now say that the political thinking of the framers of our Constitution was based on Judeo-Christian religious heritage, where our laws and rights are believed to have come from God rather than legislators. But logically, I think that if gays and atheists have equal rights in one country but face execution in another, then those rights did not come from God, or they would be universal and worldwide. And if a woman has a right to drive in one country but not in another, then we know that that right was bestowed by a human legislator in recent times. And again, this seems obvious to a lot of people, but you should see me trying to explain this to Tea Partiers, religious right people back home in Texas. So none of these changes in the books that we've been talking about are factually correct. And this is easily proven. But it doesn't matter that you can prove that all of these things are lies, because this is what every child is taught in every school, everywhere across the country, again and again and again, by every authority figure they know. And it isn't possible to reach all of these kids, to undo the damage before it sets in, because this is a form of programming. Many Americans don't realize they've been lied to until they go to college, which many don't, because my country no longer respects higher education the way we used to. And we don't respect academic expertise either. So if the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists have achieved consensus on climate change, evolution, sustainable energy, or some other unpopular notion, religious believers will simply dismiss it as if the opinionated, uneducated, ignorant masses somehow know better than all the world's best educated expert specialists anywhere ever. And as I said, I've been giving this presentation across Europe. And I asked them, if you've been watching our political circus from abroad, shaking your head in wonder at the ineptitude of even those applying for our highest position, you're wondering what the hell happened to the United States? You started out so promising. Where did you go wrong? This is it, and this is how they've perpetuated through the denigration of education and the systematic, system-wide religious indoctrination attempting to turn us all into sheep.